Swami Abhedananda, A Spiritual Biography by Moni Bagchi. Chapter-1, The Social Background. A celebrated author once said, "The individual is not an isolated unit, but is part of a whole composed of many other individuals. This whole is called society. The relation between the individual and the social whole of which he is a part is an organic relation. It means that the individual can fulfill himself only in and through society, even as this society can fulfill its collective life only in and through the fulfillment of the individual ends of the numerous humans composing it. The individual and the society to which he belongs are thus interdependent upon one another for their self-fulfillment." This is a remarkable observation of an eminent social philosopher and can be helpful to us in grasping the background of our subject. All the things that differentiate man from the rest of the creation, so far as we know it, his reason, emotions, his will and power of knowing himself, and his capacity for love and self-sacrifice, all these are evolved in and through his social life and relations. The individual finds his highest self-expression and self-realization in and through his society, even as society finds its highest expression and realization in and through the life and activities of the individuals composing it. The individual and his society are like the warp and woof of the social fabric. To truly understand the individual, we must see him in and through his social setting. And to correctly appraise social values, we must see society in and through the life and aspirations, the struggles and achievements of its individual human units. The value of the life story of any individual consists therefore not in itself, however great or noble that life may be, but only as a revelation, an explanation and interpretation of the hidden currents of social history and evolution that, entering into it, shapes and molds it to its universal end. That end is the education of the humanity at large. In this view, biographies of individuals become both the text and the commentaries of universal social revelations. The real value of the life story of any individual is therefore not in itself, but in the elucidation of social life and movements that play around that life. The period covered by the life of Swami Abhedananda reveals a most important epoch of modern Indian history, and also to some extent of the Western world during that period. The 73 years of his life have seen mighty transformation in Indian as well as Western thought and religion. The social and religious life of 73 years ago cannot be conjured and conjectured at this distance of time. And Swami Abhedananda had the proud privilege of witnessing, and indeed personally sharing in his own way, the toils and turmoils through which these mighty transformations in Indian and Western thought and life did take place. So before we actually come to narrate his life story, we have to try to use the thread of his personal life only to weave together the history of his times. So let us begin our narration with a short but precise account of the scene and society in which Swami Abhedananda opened his eyes as Kali Prasad Chandra, son of Rasiklal Chandra, a school teacher. The 1860s drew into Bengal some of the mightiest souls who were destined to leave their mark in almost every field of national as well as international culture. The last century had a grand entrance and an equally grand exit. Its existence was ushered in by Raja Ramamohan Roy, and its passing away was heralded forth by Ishwar Chandra Vidsagar, Ramakrishna, Keshab Chandra Sen, and Bankim Chandra. And it was reserved for Swami Vivekananda to toll its death knell himself, following it just on the advent of the year 1900. The year 1817 witnessed the establishment of the Hindu College, the nursery of some of the outstanding personalities of Bengal. But the first generation of English-educated men preceded the era of college and schools, and consisted of such characters as Rammohan Roy, Raja Radha Kanto Deb, and the grandfather of Keshab, Diwan Ram Kamal Sen. They were sound, substantial, self-made men, uncrammed, untitled, without much mechanical finish about their intellectual outfit, but with indigenous homespun faculties, definite religious impressions, and a sturdy backbone to their character. They were few numerically. They had fought their way to knowledge and distinction through enormous difficulties, and their influence was not immediately transmitted to their successors. The next generation of men might be looked upon as the first fruits of English education in the land. They were of a different type. The very touch of European knowledge affected their ancestral orthodoxy, and succeeding batches of graduates came out of the Hindu college with their idolatrous faith completely bleached out of them. The educationists of the time, who were mostly foreigners, congratulated themselves on this result, little perceiving at the time that the loss of Hindu orthodoxy meant the obliteration of every sense of religion. And thus, with their healthy Hindu intelligence sickled over with a pale cast of Western light, too faint to guide them in their path, these young men were unfastened from the safe anchorage of social customs, with the authority of centuries of time-honored tradition at their bottom. They drifted away yearly in great numbers to every species of radical doubt and moral irregularity. They were emasculated, giddied, or more or less denationalized. Enthusiastic Christian missionaries, official philanthropists, and immature ethnic philosophers of all kinds looked with complacence for the approaching or the actual downfall of caste. Idolatry, they said, was doomed, and so indeed it was. But no one gave a moment's reflection to the question whether the doom of caste and idolatry would not at the same time mean the doom of the fine old national character. We all know of the extravagances of the race of young Hindu reformers that sat at the feet of Derozio, the Eurasian Byron, who led them captive by his erratic genius and nonchalant self-indulgence. We all know of the fatherly philanthropy and reputed infidelity of David Har, the pioneer of English education in Calcutta. These were the creators of the first generations of educated Bengalis. But the salt had not altogether lost its savor, and the first generation, whose prominent representative was perhaps the mighty Ram Gopal Ghose, retained some trace of the original vigor of the Hindu mind. But when the first half of the last century came to a close, Hindu society in Bengal presented a picture of chaos. The indications of mental irregularity became pronounced and unmistakable. The type of character known as the young Bengal was fully developed. Strong tendencies of a violent social transition had set in. What was known as education comprised a slight acquaintance with the idioms of the English language, made through an uncritical study of the writings of a number of British authors, mostly belonging to the previous centuries. Considerable value was attached to English composition, and he who could fluently speak or write in that language was looked upon as a sort of prodigy. But as a rule, education, except in rare instances, neither stimulated the intellect to originality nor influence the heart to profound impulse. On the other hand, with increasing knowledge, there was an increasing progress of secret self-indulgence. Skepticism had extensively infected the rising generation, and strict morality was ceasing to have any young hold on the Bengali youth. Not only that, bands of young men who had lost their faith in the orthodox religion of the land met frequently in debating clubs, which were then established in different quarters of Calcutta, which had created a great ferment amongst bodies of young students. They met to discuss religion and now and then assailed the superstitious notions and practices of their forefathers with truculent zeal. All these things work together to cause deep disturbance in the huge mass of native society. In fact, impurity of character among the educated became proverbial, and defiance of religion was the order of the day. All faith on morality and religion every day became weaker and tended to decay. The advancing tide of a very fixed civilization with as much evil as good in it, the flood of fashionable carnality, threatened to carry everything before it. There were no doubt some good men, both amongst Europeans and Hindus, who deplored the strange transition from extreme stagnation to headlong self-indulgence. The Europeans were too unfamiliar with native society to resist the tide, and the Hindus were too effete. Thus, the character of the rising generation of Hindus was threatened with utter ruin. The country was no doubt in a ferment, and the pulse of the nation had begun to beat quickly in unison with the new ideas and thoughts that indicated the advent of a new era. It was a new era indeed, alike in the domain of spirituality, politics, and religion. Keshab Chandra Sen's influence was then in full vigor. Ramakrishna Paramahansa's influence had just then begun to be felt. It was Keshab and his followers who brought the Paramahansa to the gaze of the public. Ramakrishna had already begun to exercise his influence upon Keshab and the Brahmo Samaj. For we see the latter-day utterances of Keshab Sen were more or less tinged with the ideas of Ramakrishna. Thus, it can be inferred that Ramakrishna Paramahansa's influence was not altogether insignificant in the religious movement that was then going on. It was through the agency of Ramakrishna, we believe, that the motherhood of God was introduced in the new dispensation. From the contemporary accounts, we learn that in the religious world there was much ferment. In the Punjab, Swami Dayananda Saraswati was preaching his new doctrine. He was the founder of the Arya Samaj, as Ram Mohan was the founder of the Brahmo Samaj. The epoch of modern Hinduism begins as much with the Brahmo Samaj as with the Arya. Ram Mohan truly marks the beginning of a new revival in culture, in social reform, and in religious awakening. And he could clearly see the needs of his age and supply the formative spirit for the new construction. He was thus the messenger of a new social construction and the fusion of social forces. The vision of one God, untarnished by the traditions of the age, enabled him to envision the one humanity with the freedom of intermixing and interfusion. Swami Dayananda, on the other hand, used to hold that the life in the Vedic ages and times reached its highest level in illumination, and culture, intellectual, moral, and spiritual. He identified him with the cultural heritage of the rishis in the Vedas, and concentrated his energies for the revival of the Vedic studies and the Vedic discipline in life. He saw the practical utility of the synthesis of knowledge, yoga and devotion. He favored the yoga of Patanjali. If Dayananda was earnest in reviving the Vedic studies and discipline, he was no less earnest in molding society upon the ancient conception of natural fitness, character, and adaptation. and not upon blood inheritance. An out-and-out critic of the social system of the Hindus, which was prevalent in his time, Dayananda had no conservative instinct, but he based his ideas upon the Vedas. Thus, he was destined and determined to initiate a revival of Vedic culture, which is the foundation of all other reformation. To this end, he founded the society now widely known by the name of the Arya Samaj. In Bengal, Devendranath Tagore and Keshav Chandra Sen were working enthusiastically. Devendranath combined in himself an intuitive and rational mind. In Ram Mohan, he foresaw the universal church of humanity, but it was Devendranath, his spiritual inheritor, who formally established the theistic church conceived in the universal spirit. Devendranath, who was a living figure of faith and communion, reminds us of the rishis of yore in his calm responsiveness to the finer intuitions of spirit in his soul and in all the varied expressions of life. Keshav too had a receptive soul. He had the spirit of constant communion with Devendranath. His whole art of life was intense and long continued prayer, and in prayer he could find the perennial light and the transparent life. If the Vedic seers saw the truth in the silent forces of nature, the Upanishadic seers saw it in the silence of the soul. But Keshav's yearning went further. He saw the face of God in nature, on the communion of spirit in the souls, which carries it far beyond nature and soul and reveals God on his transcendent beatitude. He sought the divine in nature, in man, and in the divine himself. The synthesis which Ram Mohan established is an intellectual synthesis, but Keshav drew his inspiration from life, and he saw a finer synthesis of faiths, since they are ultimately inspirations from life. Ramakrishna, who was a close contemporary of Keshav, is one of the most potent forces in the present-day cultural and spiritual life of India. He outshines all his predecessors and contemporaries by virtue of his being the silent man of God, a child of nature and a child of the Divine Mother. The 19th century Renaissance, it should be borne in mind, witnessed a remarkable outburst of intellectual activity in India and a radical transformation in her social and religious ideas. The new spirit of the age is strikingly illustrated first by the life of Ram Mohan, and subsequently by others, and finally by the life of Ramakrishna, which forms the real background of the life and career of Swami Abhedananda, who proclaimed himself as the humble spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna. One cannot therefore enter into the life of this great Vedantic preacher and thinker without first comprehending the spiritual synthesis of his master, with whom he came in contact when Kali Prasad, the future Swami Abhedananda, was just a teenager and a schoolboy. But before that, let us have a glimpse into the spiritual backdrop of his life.